His daughters were losing weight as if they were slowly fading away, and no one could explain why. While doctors were baffled, he blamed work for losing sight of them. The stepmother, the only one who seemed to care, was the one who, little by little, was pushing them toward collapse. Edward Miller never imagined he'd get a call from the school at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. The principal's trembling voice cut through the noise of his board meeting like a sharp blade. "Mr. Miller, you need to come pick up Clara and Beatrice immediately. They fainted during gym class." The 45-year-old businessman left the contracts on the polished conference table, ignored the protests of his partners, and ran to the Mercedes parked in the garage of the office building. During the drive through the congested streets of New York City, his hands sweated on the steering wheel as he tried to remember the last time he'd really looked at his 15-year-old twin daughters. Guilt hit him like a cold wave. For the past few months, Edward had thrown himself headfirst into expanding the family business, a chain of clothing stores he'd inherited from his father, and turned into an empire. His meetings started at 7 in the morning and ended after 10 at night. When he got home, Clara and Beatrice were already in their rooms, and in the morning when he came down for coffee, they had already left for school. Marlene, his wife of 5 years, always reassured him, "Don't worry, honey, I'm taking care of everything. The girls are fine, just going through a typical teenage phase." At the private school where the twins had studied since they were little, Edward found Clara and Beatrice sitting in the nurse's office, pale as ghosts. The contrast with his memory of them was shocking. When was the last time he'd truly seen them? 2 months ago? 3? The two girls, who had always been full of energy and quick to smile, now looked like faded versions of themselves. "Dad?" Clara lifted her brown eyes, identical to his, but surrounded by dark circles that shouldn't exist on the face of a 15-year-old. "I'm here, honey." Edward knelt before them, noticing how their school uniforms seemed far too large on their frail bodies. "What happened?" "We got dizzy on the court," Beatrice murmured, her voice as weak as a thread. "We couldn't breathe right." The school nurse, a grey-haired woman with a worried expression, pulled Edward aside. "Mr. Miller, I need to be frank with you. The girls have been losing a drastic amount of weight over the last few months. The teachers have mentioned that they sleep during class, don't participate in activities, and barely talk to their friends." Edward felt his stomach clench. "They eat well at home. Marlene always prepares balanced meals." "It might be best to see a doctor," the nurse suggested, handing him a piece of paper with some notes. "I wrote down some of our observations. They frequently complain of stomach aches and nausea, especially after the lunch they bring from home." In the car on the way home, Edward watched his daughters in the rearview mirror. Clara had rested her head on Beatrice's shoulder, and both seemed too exhausted to keep their eyes open. When had they become strangers to him? When had he stopped knowing their tastes, their fears, their dreams? The townhouse on the Upper East Side seemed even more imposing under the golden afternoon light. Marlene was waiting for them at the front door, elegant as always in her navy blue dress and impeccably styled blonde hair. "Oh my God, what happened?" She rushed toward the girls, wrapping them in a protective embrace. "You poor things. You must be exhausted." "They fainted at school," Edward explained, watching as Marlene immediately took control of the situation. "Come on, girls, I'll make you some calming tea and a nutritious soup. You need to rest." Marlene led Clara and Beatrice inside with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what to do. Edward followed them, feeling like an outsider in his own home. In the spacious foyer decorated with marble and works of art, he stopped to really look around. When was the last time he'd paid attention to the details of his family's routine? "Edward, honey," Marlene said, coming back down the stairs where she had left the girls. "They're going through a tough phase. Adolescence is complicated, especially without their biological mother to guide them. I've been doing my best, but maybe we need professional help. The nurse said they've lost a lot of weight." Marlene sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. I've tried everything. I make special meals, vitamins, supplements, but they refuse almost everything I offer. It's like they're on an emotional hunger strike." Edward sat down heavily on the living room sofa. The guilt weighed on his shoulders, like lead. After Lucy, the girl's mother, died in a car accident when they were 10, He had thrown himself into his work to escape the pain. Marlene had entered their lives like a lifeline, taking over the girls' care with admirable dedication. "I'm cancelling my meetings for tomorrow," he decided. "I want to take them to a doctor." "I've already made an appointment with a specialist for Thursday," Marlene anticipated, as she always did. "Dr. Richard Clark, an excellent gastroenterologist. He'll investigate if there's some digestive issue causing these symptoms." Edward nodded, grateful once again for his wife's efficiency. "You think of everything." "It's my job to take care of this family," she replied, kissing his forehead. "Now I'm going to go up to see how they are and make that vegetable soup that usually helps when they're feeling unwell." Alone in the living room, Edward opened his laptop and tried to focus on his backed-up emails, but his thoughts kept returning to his daughters. When Clara and Beatrice were little after Lucy's death, they would cling to him like shipwreck survivors. They cried when he left for work and ran into his arms when he returned. At what point had that connection been lost? An hour later, Marlene came down with a tray holding 2 steaming bowls of soup. "They managed to have a little. That's progress. Can I go up and see them?" "They're sleeping. It's better to let them rest. The doctor said sleep is crucial for recovery." Edward agreed, but a strange unease settled in his chest. There was something he couldn't put his finger on, a feeling that important pieces of the puzzle were missing. Why had the girls become so distant from him? Why did they seem afraid to express what they were feeling? That night, during the silent dinner he shared only with Marlene, Edward made a decision. "I'm going to reorganize my schedule. The girls need me." "Of course, honey. But don't blame yourself so much. You're a wonderful father, just very busy. All successful businessmen go through this." After dinner, Edward went upstairs to check on the girls. Their bedroom door was ajar, and he could see Clara and Beatrice sleeping in their twin beds. Even in the dark, they looked too fragile, like wounded birds. It was then that he heard muffled voices coming from the office next door. Marlene was on the phone, speaking softly, but her tone seemed tense. "It can't go on like this. They're getting suspicious. Like, you need to be more careful." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Who was Marlene talking to at this hour? And what was she discussing so secretively? The appointment with Dr. Richard Clark was on a rainy Thursday morning. Edward watched his daughters in the back seat of the car as Marlene drove down Park Avenue toward the medical building. Clara and Beatrice looked even more worn out than 2 days before, if that was even possible. "Girls, how are you feeling today?" Edward turned around, trying to make some kind of connection. "Tired," Clara murmured, without taking her eyes off the rain-streaked window. "Always tired," Beatrice added, her voice barely audible. Edward noticed how they avoided his gaze. When had his daughters started treating him like a stranger? The memory of them as little girls, running into his arms, shouting, "Daddy's home," now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Dr. Clark's office was in a luxury building on the Upper East Side. Marlene knew the way perfectly, parked with ease, and led the group to the elevator with the naturalness of someone who had been there many times before. "Have you brought the girls here before?" Edward asked as they went up. "Just for a routine checkup a few weeks ago," Marlene answered quickly, "when I realized they weren't well." In the waiting room, Edward observed the other patients, stressed-out executives, middle-aged women, a few teenagers with their parents. They all looked healthier than his daughters. Clara and Beatrice sat together in chairs in the corner, huddled together as if trying to disappear. "Clara and Beatrice Miller," a nurse called after 40 minutes. Dr. Richard Clark was a tall man, about 50, with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He greeted Edward with a firm handshake, but Edward noticed how his eyes lingered on Marlene and how she smiled at him with a familiarity that seemed to go beyond a typical doctor-patient relationship. "Mr. Miller, your wife has told me about the girls' symptoms. Weight loss, fatigue, nausea, fainting spells. We'll investigate all possibilities." During the exam, Dr. Clark was thorough. He measured the twins' weight and height, listened to their hearts, examined their throats, and asked questions about their eating and sleeping habits. Edward was shocked to learn that Clara had lost 18 pounds in 2 months and Beatrice 15. That's a lot in a short time for teenagers, Edward commented, worried. Yes, it's significant, the doctor agreed, but his tone remained calm. We'll order a full blood panel, an abdominal ultrasound, and an endoscopy if necessary. As Dr. Clark explained the procedures, Edward noticed something strange. Whenever the doctor asked the girls a direct question, they would glance at Marlene before answering, as if they needed her permission. Girls, do you feel any stomach pain? The doctor asked. Clara and Beatrice exchanged quick looks with Marlene before nodding. Mostly after meals, Clara said. The food just sits there, Beatrice added. Edward frowned. At home, he rarely saw the girls during meals. For the past few months, when he got home from work, Marlene would always explain that they had already eaten dinner and were studying, or that they weren't feeling well and had eaten something light in their room. And your appetite? Dr. Clark continued. Very low, Marlene answered before the girls could speak. I prepare special meals, nutritious soups, liquid vitamins, but they refuse almost everything. Edward watched his daughter's expressions. For a split second, he saw something flash in Clara's eyes, a shadow of confusion, maybe fear. But it was so quick he almost thought he'd imagined it. After the appointment, while they were scheduling the tests, Edward overheard Dr. Clark say quietly to Marlene, I need to talk to you later, about that matter we discussed. Marlene nodded discreetly, but Edward caught the exchange of glances. What matter? When had they spoken before? Back in the car, the girls slept the entire way. Edward took the opportunity to question Marlene. Have you known Dr. Clark for a long time? Not really. A friend recommended him when I started getting worried about the girls. He seemed to know you well. Marlene gave a forced laugh. Edward, you're being paranoid. It's just professionalism. But Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was being left unsaid. The way the doctor had looked at Marlene, the subtle intimacy between them, the way Clara and Beatrice seemed conditioned to seek her approval before giving any answer. That afternoon, Edward decided to work from home. He set himself up in the second-floor office and tried to focus on financial reports, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his daughters. Around 5 o'clock, he went downstairs for a coffee. The kitchen was empty, but he heard voices coming from the pantry. Marlene was on the phone, again in a low, urgent tone. We can't speed things up too much, and if they get suspicious, I need more time to lay the groundwork. Edward hid behind the kitchen door, his heart racing. Who was Marlene talking about? And what groundwork did she need to prepare? Edward is starting to ask questions. Yes, I know it was your idea to let him come to the appointment, but he's watching too closely. Edward felt the blood run cold in his veins. Whose idea? Dr. Clark's? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Clara was coming, down slowly, holding onto the railing like a much older person. Dad? She seemed surprised to see him in the kitchen. You're home early. I decided to work from here today. How are you feeling? Clara hesitated, glancing toward the pantry where Marlene was still speaking softly on the phone. I'm okay. Clara, you can be honest with me. Is there anything you want to tell me? For a moment, Edward saw a flicker of hope in his daughter's eyes. She took a step toward him, her lips parting as if she were about to say something important. But then, Marlene emerged from the pantry, slipping her phone into her pocket. Clara, sweetie, what are you doing downstairs? You should be resting. I just wanted some water, Clara mumbled, and Edward saw how she instantly recoiled, like a flower closing its petals. Let me get that for you, and I'll make you a special snack, that smoothie you like. Edward watched as Marlene led Clara back to her room, gentle but firm. There was something in the way she controlled the girl's every move that deeply unsettled him. Later at dinner, which he made a point of sharing with the family, for the first time in months, Edward noticed that Clara and Beatrice were eating from different plates. While he and Marlene had lasagna, the girls had a thin, almost transparent soup. Why aren't they eating the same food as us? Edward asked. Dr. Clark recommended a lighter diet until we find out what's causing the nausea, Marlene explained patiently. Solid foods could make the symptoms worse. Edward accepted the explanation, but something bothered him. The girls' soup had a strange, slightly medicinal smell, and he noticed how they drank it with barely concealed expressions of disgust. "Does it taste okay?" Edward asked Beatrice. She nodded quickly, but Edward caught the warning look Marlene shot her way. That night, Edward decided to stay awake after Marlene fell asleep. Around midnight, he slipped out of the bedroom and walked through the halls of the house. He stopped in front of the girl's door and heard quiet voices. "I can't take it anymore, Clara," Beatrice whispered. "I feel so weak." "I know, but she said it's for our own good. That Dad wouldn't understand." "But what if she's wrong? What if—" "Shh! She might hear us." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. What were the girls talking about? What had Marlene told them that he wouldn't understand? He was about to knock when he heard footsteps in the hall behind him. Marlene was approaching, wearing a silk robe, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups. "Edward, what are you doing here?" "I heard the girls talking. They sounded scared." "They must be having nightmares. It's common with nutritional deficiencies." Marlene spoke naturally, but Edward noticed how she positioned herself between him and the door. "I brought them some calming tea. It helps them sleep better." Edward looked at the tray. The tea had the same medicinal smell as the soup from dinner. "What kind of tea is this?" "A mix of natural herbs, chamomile, lemon balm, some vitamin supplements." Marlene smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "Now come on, let me take care of them. You have an important meeting early tomorrow." Edward allowed her to lead him back to their room, but a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. There were patterns he was only now starting to see: the secret phone calls, the intimacy with Dr. Clark, the absolute control over everything the girls ate and drank, the way Clara and Beatrice seemed terrified. Lying in bed next to a peacefully sleeping Marlene, Edward made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start watching more closely. Something was deeply wrong in his own house, under his own roof, and he had been too blind to see it. But as he planned how to uncover the truth, Edward didn't know that in the room next door, Clara and Beatrice lay awake, holding hands in the dark, fighting the sleep the tea was forcing upon them, whispering desperate prayers that anyone would realize they were crying for help in a way they didn't know how to express. Edward woke up on Friday with a determination he hadn't felt in months. He had spent the entire night thinking about the whispered words he'd heard from his daughters. She said that Dad wouldn't understand. What exactly had Marlene told Clara and Beatrice about him? And why did his own daughters seem afraid to trust him? At 7 in the morning, he went down to the kitchen and found Marlene preparing the girls' morning smoothies. She was wearing rubber gloves, which Edward found strange for making a simple fruit drink. "Good morning. Why?" "The gloves?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Marlene jumped slightly, as if she hadn't heard him come down. "Oh, it's just... I have an allergy on my hands. Dryness." She quickly took off the gloves and put them in a drawer. "You're up early again." "I want to spend more time with the girls." Edward approached the counter where she was making the drinks. The smoothies had the same strangely pale color as the day before. "Can I help?" "No need to bother, honey. I know exactly how they like them." Edward noticed several small packets scattered on the counter, all face down. "What are these supplements?" Marlene quickly gathered the packets. "Vitamin C, iron, B complex, basic things to help with their recovery." But Edward had managed to read one of the packets before she scooped it up. Senna, a name he didn't recognize, but it sounded more like a medication than a vitamin. When Clara and Beatrice came down for breakfast, Edward was shocked by their appearance. In just a week, they seemed to have aged years. Their school clothes hung loosely on their increasingly thin bodies, and they both moved as if every step was a monumental effort. "How did you sleep last night?" Edward asked, sitting at the table with them for the first time in months. "Fine," Clara lied, but Edward noticed the deep, dark circles around her eyes. "Did you have any nightmares?" The girls glanced at each other quickly before Beatrice answered, "Sometimes." "About what?" "Edward, don't interrogate the girls first thing in the morning," Marlene intervened, placing the smoothies in front of the twins. "They need to drink this before it gets warm." Edward watched his daughters drink the smoothies with expressions of disguised disgust. "Girls, how about I take you to school today?" "That's not necessary," Marlene said quickly. The driver is already on his way. I'd like to talk to their teachers, see how they're doing in their classes. Marlene hesitated. Well, actually, they've been absent a lot lately. They haven't been feeling well enough to attend regularly. Edward frowned. How long has this been going on? A few weeks. You've been so busy that... I want to see their school reports. Today. After the girls left, and Edward noticed how they could barely carry their backpacks, he decided to cancel all his morning meetings. He had more important things to do. First, he called the school. The conversation with the principal was even more alarming than he'd expected. "Mr. Miller, I've been worried about Clara and Beatrice for weeks," said Mrs. Evans, the principal. "They've missed a lot of school, and when they do come, they're sleeping in class. Teachers report that they seem constantly nauseous and dizzy. Why wasn't I informed sooner?" "Well, your wife said you were aware of the situation and that they were under medical treatment. In fact, she asked us not to bother you with the details. Said you were going through a stressful period at work." Edward felt his blood boil. Marlene had lied to the school, using his work as an excuse to keep him away from his daughter's situation. "Mrs. Evans, from now on, any issue involving my daughters is to be communicated directly to me. Do not accept any instructions to the contrary." After hanging up, Edward went up to the girls' room. He needed to understand what was happening. On Clara's nightstand, he found a diary. He hesitated for a moment, respecting his daughter's privacy. But his concern won out. The last few entries were devastating. March 15th. "I can't eat almost anything anymore. Everything Marlene makes has a weird taste, but she says it's for my own good. She said Dad would be so mad if he knew we weren't eating right, that he's already so stressed with work." March 18th. Beatrice fainted in gym class again. "The teacher wants to talk to Dad, but Marlene said we can't bother him right now. She said he might freak out if he finds out we're sick again, like he freaked out when Mom..." March 22nd. "I heard Marlene on the phone talking about us. I didn't understand everything, but she was talking about results and insurance. I'm scared to ask, I'm scared of everything." Edward felt his legs go weak. His daughters were suffering and had been manipulated into believing he didn't care, that he would freak out if he knew the truth. The reference to their mother was particularly painful. After Lucy's death, he had indeed gone through a very difficult period, and apparently Marlene was using that against him. The sound of the front door opening alerted him. Marlene was home. Edward quickly put the diary away and went downstairs. "Back from work early again?" she asked, carrying shopping bags. "Marlene, we need to talk." "Of course, honey. Just let me put these things away." Edward followed her to the kitchen and watched as she put the items away. Most were products he didn't recognize, small bottles with labels that looked pharmaceutical. "What are these things?" "Special supplements for the girls. Dr. Richard recommended a more specific line of treatment." "What kind of treatment?" Marlene hesitated, organizing the bottles in a cabinet that Edward had never seen locked before. "It's complex. It has to do with the nutritional deficiencies they've developed." He explained that cases like theirs require very specific supplementation. "Marlene, I called the school today." She stiffened for a moment. "Oh, really? Why did you tell them not to inform me about the girl's situation?" "I never said that." The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "The principal told me the exact opposite." Marlene turned to face him, and Edward saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, a calculated coldness that made him take a step back. "Edward, you've been so absent from the girls' lives that you have no idea what they've been through. When you were coming home after midnight and leaving before 7 in the morning, who do you think was dealing with their crises, with the nightmares, the refusal to eat, the tears? But why didn't you tell me? Because every time I tried to talk about problems with the girls, you cut me off with some urgent work issue. You made it clear that I was supposed to handle everything on my own." Edward felt confused. It was true he had become very distant from his family, but he didn't remember saying that explicitly. Or had he? "Even so, the situation is critical now. They're very sick." "I know that better than anyone," Marlene said, her voice growing sharper. "I've been taking care of them alone while you built your business empire. Now that you've decided to care, don't come questioning my methods." At that moment, the phone rang. Marlene answered it quickly. Hello? Yes, this is she. What, when? Her expression changed drastically. Yes, we'll be right there. What is it? Edward asked when she hung up. It was the school. Beatrice fainted again, and they're having trouble waking her up. They're asking us to come get her immediately. In the car on the way to the school, Edward watched Marlene. In the rearview mirror, she seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone and biting her lower lip, a habit he'd never noticed before. Who are you texting? Dr. Richard, letting him know what happened with Beatrice. When they arrived at the school, they found Beatrice in the nurse's office, conscious but extremely pale and weak. Clara was by her sister's side, holding her hand and crying silently. How is she? Edward asked the nurse. Better now, but it was scary. She passed out during history class and was unresponsive for several minutes. Her blood pressure was very low. Edward knelt beside the cot where Beatrice was lying. How do you feel, honey? Dizzy and really nauseous, she murmured. When was the last time you ate something solid? Beatrice looked nervously at Marlene before answering. I don't remember. Everything I eat comes back up. We're going to the hospital, Edward decided. Right now. That's not necessary, Marlene protested. I can take her home and call Dr. Richard. Marlene, my daughter fainted and was unconscious. That's not normal. We're going to the emergency room. That's when something unexpected happened. The door to the nurse's office opened, and an elderly couple rushed in. Edward immediately recognized Lucy's parents, the girl's maternal grandparents. Grandpa, Grandma, Clara exclaimed, and for the first time in months, Edward saw a flash of genuine joy on his daughter's face. We got a call from the school saying Beatrice had fainted, said Anthony, the grandfather, looking accusingly at Edward. We came as soon as we heard. Carmen, the grandmother, approached Beatrice with tears in her eyes. My God, you're so thin. What's happening to our girls? Edward was confused. How did you know? We just got here. Someone called us an hour ago saying the girls were very sick and that you weren't taking proper care of them, Anthony replied coldly. It seems the call was accurate. Edward looked at Marlene, who avoided his gaze. Who had called the grandparents, and why now? We need to get them a full medical evaluation, Carmen said firmly. At a real hospital, not with this private doctor you've chosen. What private doctor? Anthony asked. A gastroenterologist who's been treating them, Edward explained. And what did he say they have? Edward realized he didn't know the answer to that question. Dr. Clark had never given a definitive diagnosis, only ordered tests that seemed to lead nowhere. We're still investigating, Marlene answered quickly. Carmen took out her phone. I'm calling my doctor. Dr. Evans has worked at Mount Sinai for 30 years. He'll see the girls today. That's not necessary, Marlene protested, but her voice sounded desperate. They have a doctor. A doctor who lets two healthy teenagers waste away until they're fainting from weakness, Anthony shot back. What kind of competent doctor is that? Edward watched the growing tension in the room. The grandparents clearly blamed him for their granddaughter's condition. Marlene seemed to be losing control of the situation, and his daughters were at the center of a war they didn't fully understand. But it was Clara who surprised everyone by whispering, Please, Grandpa, I want to go with you. The simple sentence echoed in the room like a gunshot. Clara was asking to leave with her grandparents. Edward felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. His daughters didn't trust him, his in-laws blamed him for the situation, and Marlene seemed to be hiding something he was just beginning to suspect was far worse than he had ever imagined. Mount Sinai Hospital was bustling that Friday afternoon. Edward followed the girls, grandparents through the white corridors, carrying Beatrice in his arms while Clara walked beside her grandmother, holding her hand tightly. Marlene trailed behind, speaking insistently into her phone in a low voice. Dr. Evans is waiting for us on the 5th floor, Carmen said, checking a message on her phone. He's the head of pediatric gastroenterology here. Edward noticed how his daughters seemed more alert in the presence of their grandparents. It had been months since he'd seen them show any kind of energy or interest in anything, but now Clara was asking questions about the hospital, and Beatrice had stopped complaining of nausea for the first time in weeks. Dad? Beatrice whispered, as they waited for the elevator. "Can Grandpa and Grandma stay with us today?" The simple question was like a dagger to Edward's heart. His daughters felt safer with their grandparents than with him. When had that happened? Dr. Evans was a man in his 60s, with completely white hair and a kind but serious expression. His office was different from Dr. Clark's, more formal, with diplomas on the walls and a medical library that took up an entire wall. "Mr. Miller," Carmen told me over the phone, "about the girl's situation. We're going to do a full evaluation." He addressed the twins directly. "Clara, Beatrice, I'm going to ask you some questions and do a few exams, okay?" For the next 40 minutes, Dr. Evans was meticulous. He weighed the girls, took their blood pressure, listened to their hearts, examined their eyes and mouths, and asked detailed questions about their symptoms. Edward watched every movement, every reaction from his daughters. "When was the last time you ate a full meal?" the doctor asked. Clara and Beatrice looked at each other, that silent communication Edward had noticed so many times. "I don't remember," Clara murmured. "It's been a long time." "And what have you been eating?" "Soups, liquid smoothies, teas," Beatrice answered, her voice almost inaudible. "Always prepared by the same person?" "By Ma." Clara started, but cut herself off, glancing quickly at Marlene. Dr. Evans noticed the hesitation. "By your stepmother?" The girls nodded shyly. "And do you feel better or worse after eating these things?" "Worse," Beatrice admitted. "I always get nauseous and my stomach hurts." Edward felt his stomach clench. His daughters were getting sick from the food Marlene prepared, and he had been completely oblivious. Marlene finally spoke up. "Doctor, they're under the care of a specialist, Dr. Richard Clark. He recommended a specific diet." Dr. Evans frowned. "Richard Clark? I don't know that name among the city's gastroenterologists. What hospital is he affiliated with?" "He has a private practice," Marlene answered quickly. "He's very well regarded." Dr. Evans made a few notes. "I'm going to order a full blood panel, including a toxicology screen. I also want to do an abdominal ultrasound and an endoscopy if necessary." "Toxicology?" Edward asked. "Why a toxicology screen?" "Because extreme weight loss associated with persistent nausea and weakness can indicate chronic food poisoning or the ingestion of inappropriate substances." Edward felt his blood run cold. "What kind of substances?" "Excessive laxatives, diuretics, appetite suppressants, substances that can cause these exact symptoms if used improperly." Marlene became visibly tense. "Doctor, that's absurd. I would never give the girls anything like that." "Of course not," Dr. Evans replied calmly. "But it's important to rule out all possibilities. The tests will give us definitive answers." While a nurse drew blood from the girls, Edward stepped out into the hallway with the grandparents. He needed air, needed to process what he had just heard. "Edward," Anthony placed a hand on his shoulder, "I need to be frank with you. For weeks we've been getting anonymous calls saying you weren't taking good care of the girls." "Anonymous calls? Someone said you were so obsessed with work that you didn't notice they were wasting away. We didn't believe it at first, but when we saw their condition today..." Edward sat down heavily in a chair in the hallway. "You think I neglected my daughters?" Carmen sat down next to him. "Edward, I knew Lucy since she was a child. She told me about her plans to have a family, about what a wonderful father you would be. After she died, we saw you suffer deeply. But in recent years, you've pulled away from us, from the girls, from everything. I was trying to rebuild my life. Marlene helped me with that. And we respected your choice, but now the girls are clearly very sick, Edward, and someone has been calling us very frequently, insisting that you aren't realizing the gravity of the situation." Edward frowned. "How frequently?" "3 times in the last week. Always the same blocked number, always the same female voice." A terrible suspicion began to form in Edward's mind. What did this voice sound like? Young, polite, concerned? Anthony hesitated. Actually, it sounded familiar, like we knew her. At that moment, Marlene came out of the office. "The test results will take a few hours. How about we take the girls home to rest?" "No," Carmen was firm. "The girls are coming to our house today. They need a different environment. That's ridiculous. They have a home. They have medical care. Marlene, maybe it's for the best, Edward intervened, just for tonight until we get the test results. Marlene's face transformed completely. The mask of motherly concern vanished, revealing an expression of cold rage. Edward, I took care of these girls alone while you worked 16 hours a day. Now you want strangers to take care of them. Strangers. Anthony stood up, indignant. We're their grandparents. The grandparents who never bothered to visit before. That's not true, Carmen protested. We tried several times, but you always said they weren't feeling well, that they had other plans. Edward looked at Marlene with a new, terrifying understanding. You stopped the grandparents from visiting the girls? I was protecting their routine. You know, how sensitive children who've lost their mother can be. Lost their mother? Clara's voice came from behind them. The girls had come out of the office and heard part of the conversation. Didn't Mom die because of us? Edward spun around. Of course not, honey. Why would you ask that? Beatrice began to cry silently. Marlene said Mom died coming back from our school party, that if she hadn't gone to pick us up, she'd still be alive. Edward felt the world collapse around him. Marlene had manipulated his daughters into feeling guilty for their own mother's death. The cruelty was unimaginable. That is a horrible lie, he said, kneeling in front of the girls. Your mother died in an accident. It was no one's fault, especially not yours. But Marlene said, Marlene lied, Edward said firmly, looking directly at his wife. And now I want to know why. Marlene realized she had lost control of the situation. Her eyes darted between Edward, the grandparents, and the girls, like a cornered animal looking for an escape. You're twisting everything, she said, her voice starting to sound hysterical. I've been trying to protect these girls for years. Edward was never around. He never really cared. Stop, Edward ordered. No more lies. It was then that Anthony had a revelation. Edward, do you remember Lucy's accident? Where exactly did it happen? Edward struggled to recall the painful details. On Park Avenue. She was coming from her doctor's office, a routine appointment. Not from the girls' school party. No, they were home with me that day. It was a Saturday. The twins looked at Marlene with expressions of shock and betrayal. The woman they had considered a substitute mother had lied about the most traumatic event of their lives. Why did you say that? Clara asked, tears streaming down her emaciated face. Why did you make us believe we killed our mom? Marlene didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her phone and started making a call. Richard, yes, it's urgent. They're figuring everything out. I need you to come to the hospital now. Edward snatched the phone from her hand. Who's Richard? The fake doctor you hired? You don't understand anything, Marlene hissed. Nothing about what's happened here. Dr. Evans appeared at the office door. Sorry to interrupt, but I managed to rush some of the basic tests. I need to speak with the guardians immediately. Edward, the grandparents, and Marlene followed him into a private room. The girls stayed in the waiting area with a nurse. The preliminary results are disturbing, Dr. Evans began. We found significant traces of senna and bisacodyl in the girls' blood. What are those substances? Edward asked. Potent laxatives. In controlled doses, they're useful medications, but with chronic use and in improper doses, they can cause the exact symptoms the girls are presenting. Extreme weight loss, dehydration, weakness, constant nausea. Edward looked at Marlene, who had gone completely pale. Doctor, Carmen asked in a trembling voice, could these substances have been administered without the girls knowing? Certainly. They can be mixed into liquids, soups, smoothies. The bitter taste can be masked with other ingredients. Edward felt a fury he had never experienced before. Marlene, what did you do to my daughters? But when he turned, Marlene was gone. The chair where she had been sitting was empty, her purse was missing, and the door to the room was ajar. Dr. Evans immediately called hospital security, but Marlene had vanished. Security cameras showed her leaving quickly through the parking garage, getting into a dark car that was waiting for her. Edward ran back to where Clara and Beatrice were waiting. When he saw them sitting together on the bench in the hallway, thin and fragile, but finally free from the person who had been slowly killing them, he couldn't hold back his tears. "Dad?" Clara stood up, concerned. "Where's Marlene?" "She's gone, honey, and she's never coming back." For the first time in months, Edward saw a flicker of hope in his daughter's eyes. 2 weeks had passed since Marlene's escape from the hospital, and Edward had completely transformed his routine. He cancelled all non-essential work commitments and began dedicating every free hour to his daughters. Clara and Beatrice were admitted to Mount Sinai for observation, where Dr. Evans carefully monitored their recovery. The process of detoxing from the substances Marlene had administered was slow and painful. The girls still suffered from nausea, abdominal pain, and extreme weakness, but they were gradually beginning to show signs of improvement. The hardest part was dealing with the psychological trauma. "Dad," Clara said one Tuesday morning, as Edward helped her with a vegetable broth prepared by the hospital staff. "Why did she do this to us?" Edward put down the spoon, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable. How do you tell a 15-year-old girl that the person she trusted had been trying to slowly kill her? "Sometimes people do terrible things for reasons we can't understand, honey. But she always said she loved us, that she was taking care of us because you couldn't." The guilt weighed on Edward again. It was true that he had been too absent, leaving a void for Marlene to manipulate the situation. "Clara, I failed you both. I should have seen what was happening." "You didn't know, Dad," Beatrice said from the next bed, her voice still weak but firmer than it had been in weeks. "She was very good at hiding it." Just then, Anthony walked into the room, carrying some flowers and magazines for his granddaughters. For 2 weeks, the grandparents had taken turns caring for them, rebuilding the bond that Marlene had systematically destroyed. "How are you two today, my dears?" "Better, Grandpa." Clara managed to smile for the first time in months. "I ate almost half my lunch yesterday." Edward watched the interaction with a mix of relief and sadness. His daughters were recovering, but the lost time would, to never come back. "Edward," Anthony called him into the hallway, "I got a call from the police this morning. They want to talk to you." Edward's stomach tightened. "About Marlene?" "Yes, and about other things they've discovered." An hour later, Edward was at the NYPD's Special Victims Division, sitting across from Detective Sandra Wallace, a woman in her 40s with a stern expression and intelligent eyes. "Mr. Miller, we've been investigating your daughter's case for 2 weeks. What we found is more serious than we initially thought." Edward leaned forward. "What did you find?" "First, about Richard Clark. There is no gastroenterologist with that name licensed by the New York State Board for Medicine. The man who posed as a doctor is actually Richard Santos, a former nurse who lost his license for professional misconduct 3 years ago." Edward felt his blood run cold. Misconduct. Falsifying medical reports, improper administration of medication, involvement in health insurance fraud schemes. The detective consulted her papers. "He has an extensive history of relationships with upper-middle-class women, always getting involved in situations that result in financial gain for him." "And Marlene, have you found her?" "Not yet, but we've discovered some interesting things about her." The detective opened a folder. "Marlene Christina Santos. Yes, she and the fake doctor share a last name. They're siblings." Edward felt the world spin. Siblings? Twins, to be precise. They have a history of working together on elaborate scams. The pattern is always the same. Marlene gets close to wealthy widowers with children, gains the family's trust, and then she and her brother execute some kind of scheme. What kind of scheme? It varies. Sometimes it's simple embezzlement. Other times, as in your case, it's something more elaborate. The detective paused. "Mr. Miller, we found evidence that Marlene took out several life insurance policies in your daughter's names over the last 6 months." Edward shot up from his chair. "Life insurance? 5 different policies, all with high payouts. The total sum would be nearly $2 million in the event of, well, in the event of the girls' deaths." The reality hit Edward like a hammer. "She was trying to kill my daughters for the insurance money." That's what our investigation indicates. The plan was to make it seem like they developed a natural illness that would justify their passing. The high doses of laxatives, administered over months, could have caused multiple organ failure. Edward sat down again, his legs trembling. For how long? How long was she doing this? Based on the medical reports and Clara's diary, we estimate it started about 6 months ago. It coincides with the period when you started working longer hours for the business expansion. And the anonymous calls to the girls' grandparents? Part of the plan. When she realized the girls were taking longer to succumb than expected, Marlene started creating a scenario where you would be blamed for neglect. The calls were to build witnesses to the fact that you weren't properly caring for your daughters. Edward covered his face with his hands. The monstrosity of the plan was almost impossible to comprehend. She lived in my house for 5 years. She took care of my daughters. How could I have been so blind? Mr. Miller, people like Marlene and Richard are extremely skilled manipulators. They study their victims, identify vulnerabilities, and systematically exploit them. Is there any chance they'll try something again? The detective's expression turned grave. It's possible. Usually when a plan like this is interrupted, the criminals become desperate. They might try to regain control of the situation. In unpredictable ways. Edward felt a chill. Are my daughters still in danger? As a precaution, we've placed security at the hospital. And I recommend that when they're discharged, you consider staying somewhere else for a while. When Edward returned to the hospital, he found Clara and Beatrice watching television in their room, something they hadn't done in months. It was a small but significant sign of recovery. How did it go with the police, Dad? Clara asked, noticing his tense expression. Edward hesitated. How much should he tell his daughters about the true extent of Marlene's betrayal? We found out that she and the fake doctor have been involved in criminal activities for a long time. Fake doctor? Beatrice sat up in bed. Dr. Clark wasn't a real doctor. No, honey, he was a con artist working with Marlene. The girls were silent for a moment, processing the information. So it was all a lie? Clara asked in a small voice. She never loved us? Edward sat on the edge of the bed and took his daughter's hands. I don't know if she ever felt anything for you, but what matters now is that you're safe and you're getting better. That night, as the girls slept, Edward stayed awake in the hospital room, watching them breathe. Dr. Evans had said they would need a few more weeks to completely clear the substances from their systems, but their progress was evident. Around 2 in the morning, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. Edward, I need to talk to you. There are things you don't understand. Meet me in the hospital parking garage in 20 minutes. Come alone, or the girls will pay. Mucker. Edward felt his heart pound. Marlene was back. And she was, threatening his daughters. He looked at Clara and Beatrice sleeping peacefully, then at the police officer guarding the door to their room. Should he call the police? But what if Marlene really had a plan to harm the girls? Another message arrived. Don't call anyone, I know there's a cop there, but I also know he can't watch you forever. Come alone if you want your daughters to be truly safe. Edward stood up silently. He knew he was making a mistake, but the threat to his daughters was too real to ignore. In the hallway, he greeted the officer. I'm just going down to the cafeteria, I won't be long. The officer nodded, remaining at his post. The hospital parking garage was dark and nearly empty at that hour. Edward looked for Marlene among the cars, his nerves on edge. Then he saw her, leaning against a black sedan at the far end of the garage. She looked different. Her hair was darker, cut differently, and she was wearing simple clothes instead of her usual elegant dresses. But her eyes were the same, cold and calculating. Edward, she said as he approached. Thanks for coming. What do you want, Marlene? First, I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this. The plan was much simpler in the beginning. What plan? To kill my daughters for money? Marlene sighed. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The debts, the threats. Richard and I had no choice. There's always a choice. You chose to try to murder 2 innocent children. They weren't going to suffer, Marlene said, as if that justified everything. The plan was for it to be quick, natural, like an illness. Edward felt sick. You're a monster. Maybe. But now we need to Solve this another way. It was then that Edward saw Richard emerge from the shadows behind another car. The man who had posed as a doctor was holding something in his hand that glinted under the dim light of the garage. "Edward," Richard said in a calm voice, "you're going to go back upstairs and bring the girls down, or this is going to end very badly for everyone." Edward realized he had walked straight into a trap, and now Clara and Beatrice were completely vulnerable in the hospital, with only one police officer between them and these two desperate predators. Edward looked at Richard, then at Marlene, trying to calculate his options. The parking garage was deserted. The object in Richard's hand glinted menacingly under the dim light, and his daughters were unprotected in the hospital. "You're out of your minds," Edward said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's a cop in the hospital. Security cameras. You're not going to get away with this." Richard chuckled softly. "Edward, you've always been naive. Did you really think we'd come here without a plan?" Marlene stepped closer. "While you're down here talking to us, someone who looks a lot like me is heading up to the girls' room." Edward's blood ran cold. "What have you done?" "My twin sister, Manuela. She's posing as a nurse and should be on the girls' floor by now." Marlene smiled coldly. "It's amazing what people don't notice when they're distracted, isn't it?" Edward started to move toward the hospital, but Richard blocked his path. "Not so fast. First, let's talk about how to resolve this without anyone getting hurt. What do you want?" "Money," Richard answered directly. "A lot of money. Enough to make up for what we lost when the original plan failed." "And in return?" "Your daughters stay alive and healthy," Marlene said as if she were offering a favor, "and we disappear forever." Edward felt fury rising inside him. "You tried to kill my daughters for 6 months, and now you want me to pay you not to finish the job?" "Edward, be practical," Marlene sighed. "You can be outraged, but the reality is we have Clara and Beatrice now, and we can do this the easy way or the hard way." At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Answer it," Richard ordered, "and put it on." "Speaker." Edward complied. The voice he heard was almost identical to Marlene's, but there was an even greater coldness to it. "Hello, Edward. This is Manuela. I'm in your daughter's room right now. They're sleeping so soundly. It would be a shame if something were to interrupt their peaceful rest." "If you hurt my daughters," Edward began. "We won't hurt anyone if you cooperate. We want $2 million in cash. You have 24 hours to get it." $2 million? That's impossible in one day." "Edward," Marlene's voice came through the phone, "you own a thriving chain of stores. You have banking contacts, investments. If you really want to save your daughters, you'll find a way. And how do I know you'll keep your end of the deal?" "Because we have no interest in complicating things further," Richard answered. "With the money, we can leave the country and start a new life far away from here. Without the money, we have nothing to lose." Edward understood the cruel logic of the situation. Desperate people were the most dangerous. "How do you want to make the exchange?" "Tomorrow night at the same place where your wife died. Park Avenue, near the medical building. Midnight sharp." Edward shuddered. They knew intimate details about Lucy's death. How much about his life had they uncovered during the 5 years Marlene lived in his house? "And the girls?" "They'll stay with us until the transaction is complete. After that, you'll never see us again." The call ended. Edward looked at Marlene and Richard, feeling completely powerless. "Now you're going to go back inside the hospital," Marlene said calmly, "and you're going to act normal. You'll say the girls are sleeping and everything is fine. If you try anything clever, Manuela will know immediately." "How?" Richard showed him a small electronic device. "Microphones in the room. We're listening to everything." Edward realized he had completely underestimated the trio's organization. They had planned this meticulously. "What if I just call the police?" "Then your daughters die before the cops even get to the room," Marlene answered without hesitation. "Manuela is very efficient when she needs to be." Edward knew he had no choice. He walked slowly back to the hospital, his mind racing to find some alternative. In the room, he found Clara and Beatrice still sleeping peacefully. A nurse he didn't recognize was checking the monitors. She was nearly identical to Marlene, but there were slight differences in her face shape and haircut. "How are they?" Edward asked quietly. "Very well, Mr. Miller, sleeping deeply." Manuela smiled, but her eyes held the same coldness as her sister's. "Sleep is essential for recovery." Edward noticed she was carrying a medical bag that looked heavier than it should. How many syringes, how many poisons did she have in there? Where's the police officer who was supposed to be at the door? He was called away to another floor urgently, an issue with a psychiatric patient. Manuela continued checking the equipment with professional ease. "But don't worry, I'm taking very good care of your daughters." Edward sat in the chair beside Clara's bed, watching Manuela's every move. She acted like a real nurse, but he knew she was a predator in disguise. "Mr. Miller," Manuela said softly, "perhaps you should go home and get some rest. The girls will sleep through the night with the medication they've received." "What medication?" "Just something to help them get some restorative sleep. Nothing harmful, of course." Manuela smiled again, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Edward understood that the girls had been sedated. They wouldn't wake up until Manuela allowed it. He was completely at the mercy of the criminals. His phone vibrated with a message. "Go home. Start getting the money. Don't try anything stupid. We're always watching." With a broken heart, Edward said goodbye to his unconscious daughters. In the hallway, he ran into Dr. Evans. "How are they tonight, Edward?" "Sleeping well. The nurse said they were given something to help them sleep." Dr. Evans frowned. "What nurse? I didn't authorize any additional medication today." Edward felt panic rise. "The nurse in the room, Manuela." "We don't have any nurse named Manuela at this hospital." Dr. Evans immediately picked up his phone. "Security to room 504, emergency." Edward ran back to the room, but it was too late. Manuela was gone. Clara and Beatrice were still in their beds, but he could now see they were much paler than before. "Dr. Evans," Edward yelled. "They look different." The doctor rushed in with a team of nurses. They immediately began checking the girls' vital signs. "They've been sedated with a strong substance," Dr. Evans said after a few minutes of examination. "But they're stable. I'm moving them to the ICU as a precaution." As the medical team worked, Edward received another message. "You shouldn't have involved the doctor. The rules have changed. The girls are coming with us right now." Before Edward could react, the hospital lights went out. Emergency sirens began to wail, and in the ensuing chaos, Edward heard screams from other floors. "It's a total power failure," someone shouted in the hallway. Edward realized it was no coincidence. Marlene, Richard, and Manuela had created a diversion to kidnap the girls during the chaos. In the darkness, Edward heard hurried footsteps in the room. When the emergency lights flickered on a few seconds later, Clara and Beatrice were gone. Dr. Evans was unconscious on the floor, an empty syringe lying beside him. Edward ran into the hallway screaming, "My daughters! Someone took my daughters!" But the hospital was in total panic. Patients screaming, nurses running back and forth, alarms blaring. In the middle of the confusion, no one had seen two unconscious girls being carried out. His phone rang again. This time, it was a video. Clara and Beatrice were in a dark location, still unconscious, lying on makeshift beds. Marlene's voice came from behind the camera. "Edward, you forced our hand. Now the rules have changed completely. If you want to see your daughters alive again, you need to bring 3 million, not 2, and you have 12 hours, not 24. The image shifted to show Marlene's face. "And Edward, if you try to involve the police this time, your daughters will never wake up from the sleep they're in now." The video ended with a terrifying image. Clara moving her head slightly, as if trying to wake up, but unable to. They were fighting whatever sedative they had been given. Edward looked around the chaotic hospital, then at the phone in his hands. His daughters were in the hands of desperate murderers. He had only 12 hours to get an impossible amount of money, and this time there was no police officer, no hospital, no one to protect Clara and Beatrice. He was completely alone against 3 criminals who had already proven they were capable of anything. Edward left the hospital at 4 in the morning, with only 8 hours to get $3 million in cash. His hands trembled as he drove through the empty streets of New York trying to formulate an impossible plan. His first stop was home. He needed to gather everything of immediate value: jewelry, watches, the cash he kept in the safe. Opening the door to the townhouse, he was hit by a wave of painful memories. This was where Marlene had lived for 5 years, where she had gained his trust, where she had meticulously planned the murder of his daughters. In his office, he opened the safe with shaking hands. There was about $50,000 in cash, some of Lucy's jewelry he had saved for Clara and Beatrice, and important documents. It was a ridiculous fraction of what he needed. His phone rang. It was another video. This time Clara was awake, but she looked confused and frightened. She was looking around a space that seemed to be a basement or an abandoned warehouse. "Dad?" Her voice was weak, still affected by the sedatives. "Dad, where am I?" Beatrice also appeared in the frame, sitting on a cot next to her sister, rubbing her eyes and trying to understand where she was. "Don't be scared, girls," Manuela's voice said from off-camera. "You're safe. We're just waiting for your father to sort out some financial matters." "Where's Dad?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. "He's taking care of you in his own way. Now get some more rest." The video showed Manuela approaching with 2 syringes. "No!" Clara cried, trying to pull away. "We don't want any more shots." "It's just to help you relax," Manuela said with false kindness. But Edward could see the cruelty in her eyes. The video cut out abruptly. Edward felt sick. His daughters were conscious, terrified, and being forcibly medicated. A message arrived soon after. 8 hours, Edward. Every hour that passes, they get another dose to keep them calm. You wouldn't want them to develop a chemical dependency, would you? Edward understood the implicit threat. Besides keeping the girls sedated, they could be getting them addicted to drugs as an additional form of torture. He immediately called his private bank manager. "Robert, it's Edward Miller. I need you to meet me at the bank right now." "Edward, it's 4:30 in the morning. The bank doesn't open until 10. "Robert, this is an extreme family emergency. I need access to all of my available cash. Now." "Edward, even if I wanted to help, there are daily withdrawal limits, security procedures. How much can I get today?" "In a special emergency operation, maybe 200,000, but I'd need documentation, justification." Edward hung up, frustrated. 200,000 was still a long way from 3 million. He called his accountant, then the company lawyer, then friends who might be able to lend him money. With each call, the reality became crueler. No one had access to that much liquid cash in a matter of hours. By 6 in the morning, Edward was in total despair. He had managed to get promises for loans totaling about $800,000, but he still needed more than 2 million. It was then that he remembered. The company had an emergency fund for paying suppliers. It was money kept in a specific account, accessible only in critical situations. He rushed to the company office and called all his partners, explaining that he needed the money for a family medical emergency. Most agreed, but the bureaucratic process would take hours. By 9 in the morning, Edward had managed to gather $1,400,000 from withdrawals, loans, and the company fund. He was still short $1,600,000. His phone rang again. Another video. This time the girls looked even more disoriented. Clara was trying to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. "I don't feel good," she mumbled to Beatrice. "Why is everything spinning?" "I'm dizzy too," Beatrice replied, holding on to her sister. "I want to go home." Manuela appeared in the frame carrying a plate of food. "Girls, you need to eat." "We don't want to eat," Clara said firmly, even in her weakened state. "You're just like Marlene. You'll put something bad in the food." Manuela laughed. "Smart, but you don't have a choice. Either you eat willingly or I give you more shots." Edward watched in horror as his daughters were forced to eat, clearly terrified but too weak to effectively resist. A new message. 4 hours, Edward, and your progress is very slow. Maybe it's time to be more creative in your methods of getting money. Edward understood the insinuation. They wanted him to do something illegal, maybe steal from his own company or commit bank fraud. Just then, his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Edward, this is Detective Sandra Wallace." Edward hesitated. The criminals had made it clear that any police involvement would result in the girls' deaths. Detective, I can't talk right now. Edward, we know your daughters have been kidnapped. We have hospital security footage of the abduction. If you know, why didn't you do anything to stop it? Because it happened too fast and they were extremely organized. But we have a proposal. Edward stopped in the middle of the street. What proposal? We've tracked the signal from the phone used to send you the videos. We know approximately where your daughters are. We can mount a rescue operation. They said they'll kill the girls if I involve the police. Edward, people like this rarely keep their victims alive after receiving the ransom. They know Clara and Beatrice can identify them. The only real chance of saving your daughters is through a police operation. Edward leaned against his car, the weight of the decision crushing him. Pay the ransom and hope they kept their word, or trust the police and risk the criminals carrying out their threats. Where are they? In an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx, an industrial area. The problem is there are only 2 access routes and they certainly have lookouts. We need time to plan properly. How much time? At least 6 hours to set up a safe operation. Edward looked at his watch. It was already 10 in the morning. The criminal's deadline was noon. I don't have 6 hours. They want the money at noon. Edward, listen to me very carefully. Even if you get all the money, the probability of your daughters getting out of this alive is very low. These criminals have already committed attempted murder. They won't leave witnesses. The cruel reality of the detective's words hit Edward like a punch. She was right. Marlene, Richard and Manuela had nothing to lose. They would probably kill the girls regardless of whether they got the money. What do you propose? That you continue trying to get the money, keeping in contact with them? That buys us time to position our team around the warehouse. When noon comes, you go to meet them as arranged, but we'll be ready to move in. Edward closed his eyes, trying to make the hardest decision of his life. Trusting the police meant risking the criminals immediately carrying out their threats. But going it alone meant almost certainly condemning his daughters to death. There's something you need to know, Edward said finally. They have a third person. Manuela, Marlene's twin sister. She was disguised as a nurse at the hospital. 3 criminals. That complicates things, but it doesn't make the operation impossible. At that moment, Edward received another video. This time the image showed Clara vomiting violently while Beatrice cried beside her. Side effects of the medication, Richard's voice explained off camera. They're rejecting what we gave them. We're going to have to try something more permanent if you don't show up with the money in 2 hours. Edward knew he no longer had a choice. Detective, I'll trust you, but if my daughters die because the operation goes wrong, Edward, we will bring them home, I promise. As Edward finalized the details with the detective, he didn't know that in the abandoned warehouse, Clara had managed to stay conscious enough to overhear a conversation between the criminals that would change everything. It doesn't matter if her father brings the money or not, she had heard Richard say to Marlene. After today, those 2 can't stay alive. They know too much about us. Clara held Beatrice's hand, who was still semi-conscious, and whispered a silent prayer. For the first time in months, she wasn't praying for someone to save her. She was praying for enough strength to save herself and her sister, because now she knew that no one else was coming to save them in time. It was 10 past noon when Edward arrived at the designated spot on Park Avenue, carrying 2 suitcases with all the money he had managed to gather, $1,400,000. He knew it was less than half of what the criminals wanted, but Detective Wallace had assured him that the rescue operation was already underway. His cell phone rang immediately. "You're late," Marlene's voice sounded cold and irritated, "and I hope you brought everything." "I brought what I could get, $1,400,000. That's less than half of what we asked for, Edward. It's all I could get in a few hours. You know it's impossible to get $3 million in cash like that." There was a long pause. Edward could hear muffled voices on the other end of the line as if they were arguing. "Change of plans," Marlene said finally. "Don't go to Park Avenue. Go to the address I'm sending you now. And, Edward, come alone or your daughters will pay for your stupidity." Edward received an address in the Bronx, exactly where the detective had said the girls were being held. This confirmed that the police had correctly tracked their location. He discreetly called the detective while he drove. They changed the meeting spot. They want me to go directly to the warehouse where the girls are. That's even better. Our men are already in position around the location. When you go in, we'll have a full view of the situation. What if they try to kill me as soon as I walk in? Edward, our team is equipped with listening devices. We'll hear everything that happens inside. At the right moment, we'll breach. 30 minutes later, Edward parked in front of an abandoned warehouse in a decaying industrial area. The place was isolated, surrounded by empty lots and other vacant buildings, perfect for criminals who didn't want to be disturbed. He took the 2 suitcases of money and walked toward the main door. Before he could knock, his phone vibrated with a message. Come in and walk to the back of the warehouse alone. The door was unlocked. Edward entered and was immediately hit by the smell of mold and decay. The warehouse was enormous, with a high ceiling and broken windows that let in shafts of sunlight. At the far end, he could see some artificial lights and what looked like makeshift partitions. "Edward!" Clara's voice echoed through the empty space. "Dad, you came!" Edward ran toward his daughter's voice, but stopped short when he saw the scene before him. Clara and Beatrice were sitting in chairs, their hands tied behind their backs. Both looked much more alert than in the videos, but still visibly weak. Marlene, Richard and Manuela stood behind the girls. Richard was holding something that glinted in his hand, a syringe. "You're just in time, Edward," Marlene said with a cruel smile. "Another 5 minutes, and your daughters would have received a final dose of our special cocktail. I brought the money I could get, now let my daughters go." Richard laughed. 1,400,000? That won't even buy the freedom of one of them, let alone both. It was all I could gather in a few hours. You know that. "Then you'll have to choose," Manuela said coldly. "Which daughter do you want to save?" Edward felt the world collapse. "That's monstrous. I'm not choosing between my daughters." "Then we'll choose for you," Marlene said, approaching Beatrice with another syringe, the younger one first. It was at that moment that Clara did something no one expected. Despite her hands being tied, she managed to get up from the chair and throw herself at Marlene, knocking the syringe to the floor. "Run, Dad!" she screamed. "They're going to kill us anyway. I heard them talking." Chaos erupted in the warehouse. Richard tried to grab Clara, but she kept fighting with a strength she shouldn't have had. After months of being poisoned, Beatrice, inspired by her sister's courage, started screaming and kicking, trying to break free as well. That's when the warehouse doors burst open with a crash and the detectives' team stormed the location. "Police! Nobody move!" Edward dropped to the floor and crawled toward his daughters, trying to shield them as the officers surrounded the criminals. "Let the girls go!" Detective Wallace yelled, pointing her gun at Richard. For a moment, Edward thought it was all over. But then he saw Manuela moving silently toward a side door he hadn't noticed before. "She's getting away!" Edward shouted. Manuela ran for the door but tripped over some debris scattered on the floor. When the officers reached her, she was on the ground, unconscious after hitting her head on a piece of rusted metal. Richard and Marlene were quickly arrested. As they were being handcuffed, Marlene looked directly at Edward. "You think you've won," she spat, "but your daughters will never forget what they went through. They'll carry this forever." "No," Clara said, her voice weak but firm as Edward cut the ropes binding her hands. "We will forget, because now we have our dad back." Clara's words brought tears to Edward's eyes. He hugged both his daughters tightly, feeling the weight of months of absence and neglect. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I let this happen to you." "You didn't know, Dad," Beatrice said, nestling into his arms. She was a very good liar. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, Dr. Evans examined the girls. "They'll need a few more days of observation to completely clear the substances from their systems, but they're doing much better than I expected." "What do you mean?" Edward asked. "It seems that for the last few days, they haven't received the usual doses of laxatives. In fact, based on the blood tests we did at the warehouse, they only received mild sedatives." Edward looked at his daughters, confused. "Why?" Clara exchanged a look with Beatrice before answering. "Because they didn't want to kill us slowly anymore. They wanted us to be awake when when the time came. The criminals' cruelty was even worse than Edward had imagined. They had stopped poisoning the girls because they wanted them to be conscious for the final act. But now, for the first time in months, Edward knew his daughters were truly safe. 3 weeks later, Clara and Beatrice were officially discharged from the hospital. Their physical recovery was swift. Their young bodies responded well to the elimination of the toxins. The emotional recovery would take longer, but with the family therapy Edward insisted on, they were making good progress. Edward had completely transformed his life. He delegated most of the company's management to trusted partners and began working primarily from home. His mornings started with family breakfast, his afternoons often included outings with his daughters, and his nights always ended with talks before bed. "Dad," Clara said one evening as he tucked her in, "do you think Marlene is suffering in prison?" Edward thought about the question. Marlene, Richard and Manuela had each been sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder and kidnapping. "I don't know, honey, but I know she can't hurt anyone anymore." "I don't feel angry at her," Clara said, surprising Edward. "I feel sorry for her. It must be sad to be a person who only knows how to hurt others." The maturity and compassion of his 15-year-old daughter amazed Edward. Marlene had tried to destroy his daughters, but she hadn't managed to destroy the essential goodness within them. "You two are stronger than she ever imagined you could be," Edward said, kissing Clara's forehead. In the next room, Beatrice was already fast asleep, a natural, restorative sleep she hadn't had in months. Edward went downstairs to the kitchen and made some tea, a new nightly routine he had adopted. As he waited for the water to boil, he looked out the window at the backyard, where he had installed a new swing set the week before. Clara and Beatrice had spent hours on it over the past few days, talking and laughing in a way they hadn't in a very long time. His phone rang. It was Anthony. "How are the girls today?" the grandfather asked, as he did every night. "Better every day. Clara managed to eat a full meal today for the first time in months, and Beatrice said she wants to go back to school next week." "And you, Edward, how are you handling all of this?" Edward hesitated before answering. The guilt was still there. It probably always would be. The feeling that he had failed as a father, that his absence had created the space for Marlene to nearly kill his daughters. "I'm learning how to be a father again, or maybe for the first time, really. It's never too late to start over, Edward. Lucy would be proud to see how you're fighting for them now." After hanging up, Edward went upstairs one more time to check on his daughters. Both were sleeping soundly, their faces relaxed and serene. For the first time in almost a year, they looked truly at peace. Edward sat in the chair between the two beds, a new addition to the room that allowed him to stay there until they fell completely asleep. "Thank you," he whispered to the ceiling, not knowing exactly who he was thanking. "For giving me a second chance, for them surviving, for us still having time." Because now he knew that time was the most precious thing he owned. Not time to build business empires or accumulate wealth, but time to be a father, to truly know his daughters, to build memories that could never be stolen or poisoned. And as he watched Clara and Beatrice breathe peacefully, Edward made a silent promise. He would never again let anything or anyone come between them. His family had survived the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger. Now it was time to build the future they deserved, together, safe, and finally free from the shadows that had almost destroyed them.